This is the story of Corvin Aldwell and his wife Petra Aldwell. They had built something that looked from the outside like a good life, a house with bookshelves on every wall, a son named Jacek who read too much and laughed too quietly, and a marriage that had survived 14 years by learning which silences were safe and which ones weren't. Petra had always been the one who managed the family's social geography, who was invited where, who was tolerated, who was loved. Corvin had let her, not out of weakness, but because he believed that love sometimes meant trusting someone else's map. What he hadn't noticed, what he'd been carefully not noticing for years, was that Jacek's name appeared on that map with a different kind of ink. The story that follows is about the moment Corvin finally looked. The morning the text arrived, Corvin was standing at the kitchen counter making coffee the way he always did. Too strong, in a French press his mother had given them as a wedding gift, which Petra had always found pretentious, and he had always found comforting. It was a Saturday in early October, the kind of day that felt like the year was quietly resigning itself. Jacek was upstairs. He was almost always upstairs now, not in the sullen, closed-off way of teenagers who are hiding something, but in the focused, self-sufficient way of a 15-year-old who had discovered that the interior life was more interesting than most of what people offered him socially. He was reading about Byzantine architecture that week. The week before, it had been the mathematics of music. Corvin sometimes stood outside his son's door just to hear the particular quality of silence inside, the kind that meant someone was thinking hard. Petra came downstairs in her weekend clothes, hair still damp, and picked up her phone from the counter without looking at Corvin. This was normal, not coldly normal, just the ordinary choreography of a long marriage. Two people sharing space the way river stones share a current, smoothed by proximity into something that no longer cut. "Your brother texted," she said, and set the phone face down again. Corvin looked at her. "About the reunion?" She opened the refrigerator and stood in front of it the way people do when they're not actually hungry, but need something to do with their hands. He picked up his phone. "Hey, quick thing about the reunion. Probably easier to say this now than at the actual thing. Jacek shouldn't come. The kids have said they're not comfortable with him there. It's nothing serious. Just easier this way. You're welcome, obviously." Corvin read it twice, then a third time, in the particular way you reread something when you understand the words perfectly, but your mind is refusing to accept the arrangement. He set the phone down, picked up his coffee. The French press was still too hot to drink properly, and he burned the edge of his lip, which felt, in that moment, like a small, appropriate punishment for nothing in particular. "Did you read this?" he asked. Petra closed the refrigerator without taking anything out. He mentioned he might say something. The air in the kitchen changed quality slightly. Not dramatically, not the way it does in arguments or revelations. More the way a room feels when you realize a window you thought was closed has been open the whole time. "He mentioned it to you, just in passing, at Mom's thing last month." She said it carefully, the way you say something you've rehearsed being casual about. "I didn't think it was worth bringing up until he actually told me my son wasn't welcome at a family event." "Corvin." She said his name not as a plea, but as a boundary marker. "Don't go here. Don't make this what it isn't. He didn't go anywhere." That was the thing about Corvin that people who didn't know him well sometimes mistook for passivity. He went very still when he was most disturbed, the way deep water doesn't move visibly at the surface. "Okay," he said. "Okay, I'm going to go to the reunion, alone." Petra watched him. There was something in her expression he couldn't quite parse. Not quite relief, not quite guilt, not quite the ordinary discomfort of a difficult conversation. Something that lived in the overlap of all three. "That might be for the best," she said finally. Upstairs, Jacek's door was still closed. From somewhere behind it came the faint, occasional sound of pages turning. Corvin stood at the bottom of the stairs for a moment and listened to his son reading about things that had been built to last, and he thought, he doesn't know yet, and then the quieter thought beneath it, how long has everyone else? He finished his coffee standing at the counter alone. Outside, the October light fell through the window at an angle that made the room look briefly, falsely golden. The Aldwell family reunion happened every 2 years, always at Corvin's brother Marcus's property in Connecticut, 40 acres of inherited land that Marcus managed with the particular pride of someone who had received something and mistaken receiving for deserving. The house was large and well maintained, and Marcus had a talent for creating occasions that felt warm from the outside and were subtly hierarchical within. Corvin drove the 3 hours alone. Petra had offered once to come, an offer so lightly made he understood it wasn't meant to be accepted. Jacek had been told that the date conflicted with a school thing, which was a lie Corvin had told with the deliberateness of someone who knows a truth would cause more damage than the protection is worth, and who also knows that this calculation is itself a kind of damage. He arrived in the early afternoon. The driveway was already lined with cars. Children ran across the lawn in that particular state of overstimulated joy that precedes by about 40 minutes a meltdown. His aunts were on the porch. His mother waved from a folding chair by the garden. Marcus came out of the front door with the practiced warmth of a host who has confused management with love. Corvin, you made it. A handshake, a half embrace. Where's Petra? Couldn't make it? Work thing. Marcus nodded in the way of someone who has been told what he expected to hear. And Jessique, school conflict, Corvin said, pleasantly, completely. Something shifted in Marcus's face. Not guilt exactly, but the brief recalibration of someone who had prepared for a harder conversation and suddenly didn't need to have it. Right. Well, grab a drink. Everyone's out back. Corvin spent the first hour doing what he did well, listening. Not performing listening, actually receiving what was happening around him, filing the small details that most people filtered out. He noticed the way his cousin Diane's older kids moved through the yard with authority, and how Marcus's son Derek, 14, moved through it with something more. Not just confidence, but a kind of territorial ease, the assurance of someone who had never been made to feel like a guest in any room. He noticed the way Jacek's name didn't come up. In 14 years of family gatherings, Jacek had always been mentioned. As a baby, as a toddler, as a child. How's Jacek? What is Jacek into now? He's so serious, that one. The comments weren't always warm. There had always been a slight edge to the way the family regarded his son's particular kind of intelligence, the way people are sometimes made uncomfortable by a child who doesn't perform being a child in the expected ways. But the name had always been present. Today, it was conspicuously absent, not forgotten, absent. There's a difference. He sat beside his Aunt Ruth after lunch. She was 73, said everything she thought, and had once told Marcus to his face that he was confusing being loud with being right. Corvin trusted her the way you trust people who have lost enough to no longer feel the need to manage impressions. You came without the boy, she said. Not accusingly. Observationally. School thing. Ruth looked at him over the rim of her lemonade. A pause. Corvin watched Derek and two of the other kids playing something in the yard that had the structure of a game, but the undertone of a performance. They were aware of being watched, and they were enjoying it. He's been doing well, Corvin said. Jacek. He got selected for a regional math competition. State level, potentially. Ruth nodded slowly. I heard something about that. From who? Oh, around. She waved a hand. You know how things get passed around. He did know. He was beginning to understand, in fact, the specific route things had been traveling. It was then, in this quiet, unremarkable moment, that Ruth said something odd. She was mid-sentence, talking about the way families tell stories about themselves. And she paused and looked somewhere slightly past Corvin, at no one in particular, and said, I don't know. Maybe, like this story, or she blinked, seeming briefly disoriented, subscribe or something. Then she shook her head as if clearing it and looked back at him. Corvin stared at her. What? Nothing, she said, with the briskness of someone who has surprised themselves. I don't know what that was. Too much sun. She set down her lemonade. What I mean is, people talk about the children they're proud of. You notice who doesn't come up. He let it go. The moment closed over itself like water. He spent the rest of the afternoon watching Derek. The boy was athletic, socially magnetic, loud in the particular way that gets rewarded in rooms where volume is mistaken for vitality. He was not unkind, exactly. He was the kind of kid who had never developed the muscle for empathy because he'd never needed it. Every room had always arranged itself around him without requiring anything in return. By the time the evening settled in and the kids were called inside, Corvin had not confronted anyone. He had not asked Marcus to explain the text, had not brought up Jasek's name, had not created any of the scenes the situation might have invited. He had watched and he had understood, and he had taken out his phone twice to take photographs of the group photos where space had been carefully arranged, of the awards displayed in Marcus's living room, all Derek's, and once, when no one was looking, a screenshot of a text chain he'd seen on his cousin Diane's unlocked phone when she'd left it on the table. A thread that included Petra's name, dated 6 weeks ago. He drove home in the dark. The highway lights came and went in intervals. He thought about Jasek reading in his room, building his vast, quiet interior world, not knowing that the family had already decided what room he belonged in. He thought, not yet, but I need to see all of it first. He waited 4 days, not out of strategy exactly, more because he needed to be sure he was asking from a place of clarity rather than from the bruised, reactive place where wrong conversations begin. He had seen the text chain. It hadn't told him everything, but it had told him enough to know that what he'd assumed was his brother's private thoughtlessness was something that had involved Petra and had been in motion for longer than a single month. He waited until Jasek was at school. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table, not at his usual end where he worked on weekends, but in the middle, so there was no implicit hierarchy of the space. When Petra came downstairs and saw him sitting there, she didn't say good morning immediately. She registered the difference. 14 years teaches you the geography of a person's intentions. Sit down, he said, not commanding. Quiet, she sat. She poured herself coffee first, and he waited while she did, because that was fair. People deserve to have something in their hands for difficult conversations. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to know before I ask it that I've thought about how to have this conversation for 4 days, and I'm trying to do it the right way. Petra held her mug in both hands. She was watching him with an expression he recognized, the careful attention she deployed when she was preparing to explain something she knew would sound worse than she wanted it to. The text chain with Marcus and Diane, he said. The one from 6 weeks ago. You were part of the conversation where they decided Jasek shouldn't come. A beat. She didn't ask how he knew. It wasn't a decision, she said. It was a conversation. About excluding our son. About, she stopped. Started again with more care. Derek had been saying things to his parents about Jasek making him feel, I don't know, inadequate. The math competition, the school awards, the way she looked at the table. The way Jasek is. The way Jasek is, Corvin repeated. He doesn't mean to do it, I know that. But he can make people feel small without trying, Corvin. You know that. He's 15. So is Derek. Corvin looked at her. He felt something in his chest that was neither anger nor grief exactly, but a compound emotion for which he didn't have a word. The feeling of watching someone you love rearrange the furniture of a truth so that it faces a more comfortable direction. So the solution, he said slowly, was to exclude Jasek from his own family's reunion. And you were part of making that decision, and you didn't tell me. I was trying to, she stopped again. To what? To keep the peace. She said it with genuine conviction. That was the thing. She believed it. Marcus was going to say something worse. At the actual reunion, in front of everyone. I thought if we got ahead of it, Petra, he said her name the way she had said his 2 weeks ago. As a marker. Look at what you just said. Actually, look at it. She looked at it. She looked at it. He watched the moment she reached the full shape of it and had to decide whether to keep defending the architecture or acknowledge the foundation. I know it looks bad, she said finally. It doesn't look bad. It is a specific thing that happened. You helped plan the exclusion of our son from a family event to protect the feelings of his cousin who was jealous of him. It's more complicated. It's also that he wasn't raising his voice. He promised himself he wouldn't, and it wasn't difficult because he wasn't angry in the hot reactive way. He was sad in the cold clarifying way, which was quieter but went much deeper. What I want to understand is, this isn't the first time, is it? Petra's hands tightened around the mug. When he didn't get invited to Derek's birthday last year, and you told me it was a small thing, just immediate family. He watched her face. It wasn't, was it, Corvin? I'm not asking you to confess. I'm asking you to help me understand when our son stopped being someone you fight for. The question hung in the kitchen for a long time. Petra looked out the window. The October light was gone now. It was November, grayer, more honest. I love Jacek, she said, and he believed her. That was the hardest part. He believed her completely, which meant that love, by itself, was not the thing that had failed here. I know you do, he said. That's not what I asked. She didn't answer. He hadn't expected her to. December came, then January. They didn't separate, not formally, not with the drama of packed bags and slammed doors. What happened was more gradual and in some ways more final. A reorganization of the space between them, subtle enough that Jacek probably didn't notice, though Corvin suspected Jacek noticed more than he indicated. His son had always been perceptive in the way of people who have learned that perception is a form of protection. Petra threw herself into work with the particular energy of someone redirecting their interior life into something manageable. She came home later. She organized things, closets, the garage, the kitchen cupboards, with an efficiency that Corvin recognized as the physical expression of wanting to feel like something, somewhere, was in order. They were polite. They were in the precise, exhausting way of a troubled marriage that hasn't yet named itself as such. Considerate. She had, Corvin understood, begun the process of reshaping the story. Not consciously, not cynically. He didn't think that. But gradually, in the way she referenced the reunion, in the rare moments it came up, the narrative had shifted. It became about Marcus's insensitivity, about the complications of blended family dynamics, about how she'd been in an impossible position. The part where she had been an active participant, had known 6 weeks in advance, had not told Corvin, had perhaps provided cover for a cruelty aimed at their son. That part had been smoothed over in the telling until it was no longer visible. He had heard her on the phone with her sister one evening in late January, not eavesdropping, but present. The way you're present in your own house. It was Marcus's thing, Petra had said. Corvin's taking it harder than, well, you know how he is about Jacek. He doesn't see how the other kids experience him. Corvin had stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he'd gone upstairs. Jacek was at his desk. New interest this week. The history of cartography. The maps of places people had charted before they fully knew the shape of what they were mapping. Hey, Corvin said from the doorway. Jacek looked up. Hey, how's the map making, cartography? But he smiled when he said it. The specific smile of someone who knows they're being gently teased by someone who loves them. Corvin came in and sat on the edge of the desk chair. He looked at the maps spread out on the surface. Old reproductions, coastlines distorted by the limits of what their makers had been able to see. You know what I think about sometimes? Corvin said. No. The people who made these, they were working with what they had. They weren't wrong exactly, they were just limited. And they drew the world as far as their vision reached, and then they marked the rest as unknown. Jacek looked at one of the maps. Some of them wrote monsters there, he said. In the blank spaces, because they didn't know. Yeah, Corvin said. They did. They sat with that for a moment. Dad, Jacek said. Yeah, the reunion thing. He said it carefully, not looking up from the map. I know there wasn't a school conflict. Corvin was quiet for a moment. I figured, Jacek said. It's fine. It's not fine. No, Jacek agreed with the composure of someone who has already done most of the grief privately. But I mean, I'm fine. I figured it out. Derek doesn't like that I'm better at things than him. You don't have to be modest about it. I'm not being modest. I'm just saying it's his problem, not mine. He looked up then. Right? Corvin looked at his son, this serious, strange, remarkable person he had helped make, and felt something break open quietly in his chest. Right, he said. The words sat there between them, carrying more weight than it looked like it could hold. March. Corvin filed for a formal separation on the 14th, a Tuesday, unremarkable in weather and light. The kind of day that doesn't seem adequate to the things that happen in it. He had made the decision not in a single moment of revelation, but over the preceding weeks, in the accumulation of small recognitions, the way he'd watched Petra at dinner, the way she'd looked at Jacek when he talked about his math competition results. A look that was proud but also, and he could not stop seeing it, faintly troubled, as though his son's achievement was a variable she needed to account for rather than a joy to simply receive. He told her on a Sunday evening. Jacek was at a friend's house, a new friend, a kid from the math team who was also quiet and interested in too many things, and who Jacek had described to Corvin with a kind of careful understatement that meant the friendship actually mattered to him. They sat in the living room. The room was familiar and strange simultaneously, the particular quality of his face you know you're beginning to say goodbye to. I've been thinking about this for a while, he said. Petra looked at him. She didn't look surprised. That was its own kind of answer. I know, she said. I want to be clear about why. He said it evenly. I'm not doing this as punishment. I'm not angry in the way you might think I am. What I understand now after everything this fall is that you and I have been managing different families. You've been managing the one that includes Marcus and Derek and the extended network and what they think, and how things look within that. And I've been managing the one that includes Jadek. That's not fair, she said. Not defensively, tiredly, like someone contesting a map they know, in some part of themselves, is accurate. It might not be fully fair, he said, but it's what I've observed, consistently and over more time than I want to add up. Petra looked at her hands. I would do it differently, she said, if I could. He believed that too. He believed almost everything she said, which had never been the problem. I know, he said, so would I. I'd have said something years ago, the first time I noticed. I let it go because I thought it was small, and because I didn't want the conflict, and because, he stopped, because I thought love was supposed to smooth things eventually, that if we just kept being decent to each other, the edges would round off. They don't, she said. No. A long silence. Outside, a car passed. The house made its ordinary sounds. He'll be okay, Petra said. Jacek, he's stronger than we give him credit for. He is, Corvin agreed. He figured out what happened at the reunion on his own and decided it was Derek's problem, not his. He's 15. A pause. I think the question isn't whether he'll be okay. I think the question is what kind of home he lives in while he's becoming who he's going to be. Petra said nothing. That was the moment, he thought later. Not the signing of papers, not the conversations with lawyers, not the eventual reorganization of their lives into two separate addresses. That silence was the moment when someone understands a thing fully and has no argument left against it, and simply has to sit with what that means. He drove to pick up Jacek an hour later. His son got into the car with the particular energy of someone who'd had a genuinely good afternoon, talking too quickly about something his new friend had said, about a problem in number theory that apparently had multiple valid solutions depending on how you framed the initial conditions. Corvin listened. The streetlights came on one by one as they drove through the neighborhood. He thought about maps with blank spaces and the people who had marked them with monsters out of fear of what they didn't know, and the other people, the fewer ones, who had simply written unknown and kept sailing anyway. Dad, Jacek said, interrupting his own story. Are you listening? Every word, Corvin said. Jacek looked at him briefly, with the assessing gaze of a person who can tell the difference between attention and presence. Then he seemed satisfied and turned back to his window and kept talking. The car moved through the dark. The world outside was full of things they hadn't mapped yet.